the subject of his resignation, insisting that he serve another term. She really helped change the course of the country and our nation's, it continued. But the specific part I wanted to show, just because the mechanics of the letter itself are really interesting. She really knows how to play at his emotions, and she very much has a mastery of words. She's very good with words. And the reason why she chose to write this letter is that they had conversed about it multiple times prior to when she actually writes the letter, but because of how close it was to him having to decide whether he was going to run, she decided that the best way she could convince him is through a letter. So this letter, this is a cool clip of the letter, because not only did she have the know-how and the way to write it and know how to write it, but Samuel Powell actually edited it for her. So to me, that shows not that she needed, a man's approval to send this letter. She and George Washington had long been corresponding, but I think she knew how important the letter was, and I think he knew how important the letter was, so he made some edits. So the word behold and the word horrid are actually in Samuel Powell's hand. So I just think that's really cool, and it. So I just think that's really interesting and shows how their relationship was. Like, they were very much partners in life, I think, much more than just husband and wife. So on an intellectual level, clearly, and no matter what, even if on the off chance Samuel Powell wrote this whole thing, which he did not, they chose to keep it in her hand. They knew that even after he read it, they knew it would be the most convincing coming from her. So that's I just love this letter. But speaking of Samuel, I do want to talk about Samuel just a bit, because I tend to leave him out sometimes of not leave him out, but he often gets kind of pushed aside because there's not as many records of his that survive. But he was very important too. And he had a really nice relationship with George Washington. They were both very interested in agriculture. So he kind of was another outlet for George Washington as far as agriculture and the fun, like, kind of casual things that Washington liked to do. So this is just one example of them interacting on that level. Samuel Powell was the president of the Philadelphia Society for Promoting Agriculture, which still exists. And so he was able to get all of the newest farming equipment and things like that. Both he and Washington were very innovative. And so this is part of a letter from George Washington to Thomas Jefferson in 1791, saying that he's about to go see a new threshing machine at Mr. Powell's farm, which is Powelton. So and he wants Jefferson to go with, and Jefferson does actually go with them. And I just like the image of the three of them just casually riding out across the Schuylkill River to go look at some farming equipment. I mean, we all need our breaks, and I think that was the three of them's way of enjoying themselves. And actually, on the Monticello website, I found that Thomas Jefferson does buy one of these threshing machines, but I think it's kind of neat that Samuel Powell had it before Thomas Jefferson. So I do want to show, to transition back to sadly after Samuel Powell dies, this map that I have overlaid on the background. This is a map from 1796. So it's a map of Philadelphia. It's done by a French map maker, I believe. It is beautiful. The library company has a copy, and so does Mount Vernon now. But what's neat is that the map shows not only the city, but it shows the western lands. So this shows, if you can see, it's a little bit faded because this is kind of a blown up image, but that says Mrs. Powell's. So this is from 1796, after Samuel has passed away, and she's inherited the entirety of his personal and real estate. So it's really cool that her stamp is on this letter, this map. Like this, it's the first time you see any of the land being addressed as hers. So it's just kind of neat and sad that she embodied this part of her husband's life, but did it so well. It's just kind of like heartbreaking that I don't know, that he died. So that's 1796. This is 1797. At the end of Washington's presidency, in beginning of 1797, his last birthnight ball was thrown. So back to the birthdays. Washington, in many, many cities, Alexandria, where I'm currently at, included, they threw birthday parties for Washington, and it was normally dances. So on his last birthnight ball, it was the biggest affair, I think, of all of them in Philly. They threw this big party because it was the last one he was going to attend, because he didn't plan to come back to Philadelphia. And they actually threw it at Ricketts Circus, or amphitheater. And that is the little domed building right there. It burned in 1799, but this is a later engraving or watercolor showing Ricketts as it would have looked in 1797. So the neat thing about this is that there's a letter talking about the party, and that Elizabeth Powell came, and she had not been out in public since her husband died, and really said she had no need to do it again. But she decided to go to honor her good friend. And so she went, and I think she also went because she was honoring her husband too, and honoring the Powells and the Washingtons' friendship together. But she was dressed in black velvet and looked very well. But I do want to say, as far as her not going into public, that's not that she wasn't seeing anybody. She just was having a lot of people over and going to a lot of people's houses. There was very much different types of public. She just wasn't really going to theater performances or assemblies or things like that. But she was also, getting older. So that's kind of the birthday part of George Washington and Elizabeth Powell. It's kind of neat that she was able to honor him one more time. So I have to include a couple of anecdotes now. They, of course, are right after this, after the birthnight ball. Washington is heading back home to Mount Vernon. And he sells furniture at the presidential mansion that John Adams does not want, and that Washington does not want to take back to Mount Vernon. So he sells his desk, which Elizabeth Powell buys. And so the desk here, this was at the Philadelphia History Museum, but now it's in Drexel University's possession. Elizabeth Powell buys this, and when she buys it, she comes across some letters. And the letters, she is looking in the drawers after she gets it, and you can see there's tons and tons of drawers in this. She ends up finding a bundle of letters from Martha Washington to George Washington, bound up in his usual accuracy, is what she says. And she teases him at the start of the letter, which actually she knew Washington wasn't going to get until he got back to Mount Vernon, which I think is kind of funny, that she's found love letters, and she's not like other women, so she's not going to look at them. But then she goes on to say, they're letters of Martha's. And then he writes back and says, I have no love letters to lose. And if the letters that you open, they were more fraught with expressions of friendship rather than enamored love. And they only would have been as warm as you expect if they had been committed to the flames. So a kind of interesting thing is that all of George and Martha's correspondence was burned. And then the two surviving letters that were received by Martha were found in a desk. So the Washingtons had some weird things about burning letters and desks. So clearly they need to be better about clearing out their desk. And I did want to briefly show, just because this is landmarks and the Powells, she talks about sealing up her package when she sends the letters back to Washington, with a seal with her blessed friend's arms. So you can see the image on the left is actually a wax seal, and then the book plate. So you can see the crest and the coat of arms. So I do want to briefly bring up Martha and Elizabeth's friendship, because they definitely were friends as well. You can't talk about George and Elizabeth without talking about Samuel and Martha. So Martha and Elizabeth very much bonded over their mutual kind of connection with the grandchildren of Martha Washington's. So the Powells came to Mount Vernon and met the grandchildren for the first time. And so after they'd met them, it was 3 little girls. Elizabeth, I'll go ahead and switch to the next slide. So Elizabeth and Martha talked about, I guess Martha wanted to get the granddaughter some posture collars. So that would be a rod going up your back and then attaching around your neck a little collar to keep you upright. So Elizabeth does send collars back to Martha, and says that they were so, they would help throw back the shoulders and hold up the head and be confident, and not be bashful. So these are the 3 granddaughters, and the 2 older ones were the ones that got the collars. And then Nellie, the one on the right, did not get a collar because she was younger, and she was very spirited. And you can kind of tell in that picture even that she was quite a kind of just spirited little girl versus her 2 older sisters. And these were done in 1786. So the Powells were at Mount Vernon in 1787. So it's kind of neat that this also is a snapshot of what they would have looked like when the Powells met them for the first time. And I really like in the quote that I included, this is when Martha is thanking Elizabeth for sending the collars. One thing that I picked up on is how Martha Washington calls Nellie my little Nellie. After Elizabeth dies, or well, before Elizabeth dies, Nellie writes to her best friend and asks her best friend to tell Elizabeth that her little Nellie will soon be a grandmother. So it's kind of neat that they both were using that same sort of nickname for her. So it very much shows the emotional connection and the real kind of broad connection Elizabeth Powell had with not only George Washington, but the entire family. So as you can see, Nellie did not get a collar, and she was kind of a little wild child. Then she grows up to be more of kind of just a little free spirit. But this is, I'm just gonna quick say, this is my other favorite anecdote related to Nellie. This is Nellie in 1796, so she's 17 and still is very much just a wild child. But she writes in 1833, when she's much older, her daughter is now in Philadelphia going to school, and Nellie is writing to her best friend asking to have updates on how her daughter is doing and how she's being received in society. And her friend writes back and says she is being well received and is very, put together. And so Nellie, in reply to that, says, "No one will ever say of Tiffin what my dear and lamented friend Mrs. Powell used to say of me. You look as if your clothes were thrown on with a pitchfork." So I think because Nellie never got a posture collar from Elizabeth, she then in turn, her clothes just always looked a mess. But I think it's kind of a neat way to think of how Elizabeth would have been interacting with the younger generation, who very much loved her, and Nellie really loved her and writes about her for the rest of her life. So I just think that's a cute little aside. Since the Powells didn't have any children, you can still see how Elizabeth would have been mothering. And this final thing, because I want to get to questions, this final thing is my favorite anecdote because it ends on a happy note. It's not Washington dying, but it's Elizabeth honoring Washington long after he's passed away. So this note is actually from Samuel Powell